China did not treat the Opium Wars as history. It treated them as a warning. Because what happened in the 1800s was not just a military defeat. It was a loss of control over trade, law, and territory, followed by decades of foreign pressure inside China's borders. And if you want to understand why modern China is so sensitive about sovereignty, why it distrusts foreign intent, and why it thinks in long timelines, you have to start here. In this video, we are going to walk through what the Opium Wars changed, what the Treaty Port era actually meant, and how that memory still shapes China's decisions today. Chapter 1. The Trade Problem. In the early 1800s, the Qing government tightly controlled foreign trade. For many Western merchants, access to China's market was limited, regulated, and concentrated in the south, near Canton. But Britain's demand for Chinese goods created a growing imbalance. Britain wanted tea, silk, and porcelain. China wanted very little from Britain in return. That gap became the pressure point that pushed British merchants and officials to look for a product that would sell inside China at scale. That product became opium, much of it tied to British commercial networks in India. Here's the part most people miss. On paper, it looked like trade. In practice, it created a crisis of social stability and state authority. As opium spread, the Qing state faced a problem that was both economic and political. If the government could not control what flowed through its ports, then it could not fully control the system that kept the empire stable. When Chinese officials moved to crack down on the opium trade and seized large quantities of the drug, Britain's response was not diplomacy, it was force. Chapter 2. War and the First Unequal Treaty. The First Opium War began in 1840. British naval power and modern weapons quickly overwhelmed Qing defenses that were not prepared for that kind of warfare. This is where the story flips because the outcome was not only military, it was legal and economic. In 1842, China signed the Treaty of Nanking. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened multiple treaty ports to foreign trade, and agreed to large indemnities. But the deeper change was what came next. Foreign powers gained special legal and commercial privileges inside China that limited what the Qing state could enforce. Some of those arrangements expanded over time into systems where foreign residents were not always subject to Chinese courts, and where trade concessions set precedents that other powers demanded as well. Keep that in mind, because it shows up again later. This was the beginning of a new pattern, where external pressure shaped internal rules. Chapter 3. What treaty ports actually changed? When people hear the phrase treaty ports, it can sound like a technical detail, like a footnote, a line in a treaty, a set of trade permissions. But treaty ports mattered because they changed daily reality. A treaty port was not just a place where foreigners could buy and sell goods. It became a place where foreign influence gained leverage inside the mechanics of a city. Over time, it affected who had power in disputes, who could pressure local officials, and how commercial life worked. It also mattered because it was visible. It was not an abstract concept. It reshaped neighborhoods, shipping routes, business practices, and the sense of who controlled what. Here is one way to think about it. In a normal system, a state sets the rules, collects taxes, enforces laws, and decides what changes and when. But the Treaty Port era introduced an uncomfortable idea. That rules inside China could be influenced by outsiders, backed by the threat of force, and treated as normal. So the memory is not just about the British Navy, it is about losing control in slow motion. This also explains something important about modern Chinese language. When Beijing talks about sovereignty, it often means more than borders. It means control over law, trade, finance, and security within those borders. It means no outside power should be able to create an exception zone inside the country. Even if you disagree with that worldview, the historical memory helps explain why it feels so emotionally charged. Chapter 4. The Second War and a Message to the Capital. The First War did not settle the issue, it created a precedent. From 1856 to 1860, Britain and France pushed for more access, more ports, and deeper presence. They wanted navigation rights on rivers. They wanted broader commercial privileges. They wanted diplomatic representation in Beijing itself. China resisted. The powers escalated. The Second Opium War ended with foreign forces reaching the capital. One of the most symbolically damaging moments was the destruction of the Old Summer Palace, a cultural landmark tied to imperial authority and civilizational pride. The point was not just material damage. The message was political. It signaled that China could not protect even what it valued most. By 1860, additional treaties expanded foreign access and reinforced a reality that many Chinese elites increasingly recognized. China's sovereignty was being constrained, piece by piece, through unequal negotiations backed by military force. Chapter 5. Unequal Treaties and the Problem of Leverage. The phrase unequal treaty is not just an insult. It describes a kind of agreement made under conditions that were not equal. One side has gunboats at your coastline, the other side has to sign. That experience leaves behind more than economic costs. It leaves behind a lesson about leverage. Because the core humiliation is not only losing a battle, it is being forced to accept rules you did not choose inside your own system because the alternative is worse. And once that pattern exists, it becomes hard to reverse. Each new concession becomes a precedent. Each precedent becomes a platform for the next demand. This is why the Opium Wars are remembered as a beginning. They did not create every later crisis, but they established the model of how a stronger power can pry open a weaker one. And this is also why modern Chinese leaders often react strongly to anything that resembles forced terms. In their political memory, forced terms are not a one-time event. They are the start of a slide. Chapter 6. Spheres of Influence. After the Opium Wars, foreign pressure intensified. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, multiple powers carved out spheres of influence, extracting privileges and controlling key trade and strategic areas. China remained formally independent, but in practice parts of its economy, ports, and legal authority were limited by foreign demands. In some major cities, foreign concessions operated with their own rules. Tariffs and customs revenues were often shaped by outside influence. In places along the coast and in the north, foreign military presence grew. Here is the part most people miss. The humiliation was not only about land. It was about being unable to set your own rules inside your own borders. And as this pressure grew, it created a feeling that the world was not governed by fairness, but by power. This culminated in repeated crises, including the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which led to a multinational intervention and further penalties. The details of each concession matter, but what matters more for modern memory is the accumulated pattern. China experienced a long period where it felt like it was reacting to events, not controlling them. Chapter 7. The Internal Response, Reform Without Control. One of the reasons this period cut so deeply is that many Chinese officials knew change was needed, but they were trying to reform while being pressured from the outside. Some tried to modernize the military. Some tried to modernize industry. Some tried to import new technology and new institutions. But reforms are harder when your trade routes are constrained, your revenue is pressured, and foreign powers have leverage in key cities. So you get a recurring sense of frustration. Not just defeat, but limitation. The feeling that even the act of rebuilding is being watched, negotiated, and constrained. That matters because it shaped the modern story China tells about itself. A story where weakness invites intrusion, and modernization becomes not just an ambition, but a survival requirement. Then the 20th century made that trauma deeper. Chapter 8. The Memory Becomes Policy. The early 1900s brought even greater upheaval. Japan's expansion into China, beginning in the 1930s and intensifying into full-scale war, became one of the most traumatic chapters of the era. Large numbers of civilians died. Cities were destroyed. The sense of vulnerability deepened. When World War II ended, China's suffering did not immediately end. Civil war resumed. In 1949, the Communist Party established the People's Republic of China, and the new state framed its legitimacy around one central claim. The era of humiliation was over, and it would not be allowed to return. This was not only rhetoric. It became a governing lens, shaping how leaders discuss security, sovereignty, and foreign influence. Now jump forward to today and watch the same logic appear. Modern policy often reflects the idea that weakness invites exploitation and strength prevents it. Chapter 9. The lesson China believes it learned. If you strip away ideology and focus only on the strategic lesson Chinese leaders often point to, it sounds like this. A weak state does not get a fair deal. A weak state gets terms. That belief shows up again and again in modern Chinese priorities. First, economic strength. If China is central to trade and manufacturing, then coercion becomes harder, because pressure on China creates pressure on everyone else too. Second, internal cohesion. The fear is that foreign pressure works best when a country is divided. That is why unity and stability are treated as security issues, not just domestic politics. Third, deterrence. Not necessarily because conflict is desired, but because the memory of gunboats and forced treaties makes leaders assume deterrence is the only reliable protection. You do not have to agree with this worldview to understand it. But if you ignore it, China's choices will feel random. And there is one more point that helps explain the long timeline thinking. China's timeline is not only cultural, it is institutional. When a political system is built around preventing a return to humiliation, it naturally prioritizes control, buffers, and strategic depth. So when you see China invest in ports, shipping lanes, supply chains, and naval modernization, it is not only about ambition, it is also about reducing vulnerability, according to the lesson it believes history taught. Chapter 10. Why Memory Becomes Strategy. To an outside observer, history can feel like something you study, then move on from. But for states, history can become policy. When a political system ties its legitimacy to preventing humiliation, it has an incentive to keep the memory alive. Not always as anger, but as vigilance. That memory is reinforced through education, public speeches, museum narratives, and a simple storyline about the past. A storyline that says, when China was weak, others imposed terms. When China became strong again, it regained control. Whether every detail of that storyline is complete is less important than the role it plays. It provides coherence. It provides a moral of the story. It explains why control and stability are treated as security issues. And it also explains why foreign pressure is often interpreted through suspicion. If the past taught you that powerful countries use rules to limit weaker ones, then you will assume the same pattern can repeat. That assumption is one of the core drivers of modern Chinese strategic culture. Chapter 11. What this explains today. This historical memory helps explain why modern China is unusually sensitive about borders, sovereignty, and foreign military presence near its coastline. From Beijing's perspective, Taiwan is not just a contemporary political dispute. It is tied to unresolved state legitimacy after 1949, and to the broader fear of foreign-backed separation that resembles earlier eras when outside powers held leverage inside China. Similarly, China's actions in the South China Sea are not only about resources or shipping lanes, they are also about security control. Beijing argues it must be able to defend the approaches to its coast and prevent hostile forces from operating freely near its territory. Whether other countries accept these claims is another matter, but the logic inside Beijing often references historical vulnerability. Keep that in mind, because it changes how you interpret China's decisions. The debate is not only over geography, it is over what history teaches about survival. China's Belt and Road Initiative also fits into this broader story. One way to prevent coercion is to become economically central. If trade routes, ports, and infrastructure depend on China, then China gains leverage and reduces the chance of strategic isolation. Some Chinese strategists frame this as rebuilding regional connectivity and influence in ways that reduce vulnerability to blockade, pressure, or containment. Now, none of this means history forces China to act in one specific way, but it does mean history shapes what feels risky, what feels unacceptable, and what feels non-negotiable. Chapter 12. The International Order Problem. There is also a broader implication of the Opium Wars that often gets missed. The experience left China deeply skeptical of an international order that it did not help design. If your first major encounters with global rules came through coercive treaties, you will likely see rules as tools of power, not neutral principles. That does not mean China rejects international institutions entirely. It means China often insists on interpreting rules through sovereignty and national interest, especially when it believes the system was built during an era when China had little say. This is why China resists external pressure over internal policy. It is why it treats certain disputes as existential. and it is why it invests heavily in strategic depth. It also helps explain why China speaks so often about dignity and national rejuvenation. Those words are not random. They are meant to reverse the emotional meaning of the 19th century. Chapter 13. Closing Insight. So the most revealing evidence that China has not forgotten the Opium Wars is not just what happened back then. It is how the memory is used. Chinese leaders in official speeches often reference the Century of Humiliation as a warning and a justification. The lesson is presented simply. Foreign pressure is real. The world is competitive. National strength is the shield. The question is not whether China remembers. It is how the memory shapes what China fears most and what it is willing to do to prevent it. While more than 170 years have passed since the First Opium War, this historical memory remains a major frame through which modern China interprets the world. To many outside observers, China's behavior can seem aggressive or irrational. But from Beijing's perspective, it is often framed as preventive, a determination to avoid a return to vulnerability, a belief that sovereignty must be defended early, not negotiated after weakness appears. If you want to predict China's moves, do not only watch today's headlines. Watch the history China teaches itself about what happens when a nation loses control of trade, law, and territory. What do you think most people misunderstand about the Opium Wars and how they still shape modern China today? Subscribe for more, comment below with your take. Thanks for watching.